Some cars were slow, some were dangerous. But these, they were disasters in every way. Ugly, broken, and sometimes deadly. Designed with no taste, built with no care. These 12 cars weren't just bad, they were national embarrassments. And yet, they were real, they were sold, and some even left people hurt. This is the dark side of American car history you were never meant to see. The 1967 Plymouth GTX 440 Super Commando was a wolf in a very polite sheep's suit. A gentleman's muscle car built not for the strip mall crowd, but for those who liked their horsepower delivered with the subtle menace of a loaded handshake. On the surface, it had all the airs of a refined, upper-trim Belvedere. Restrained lines, upscale interior touches, and just enough chrome to suggest class. But underneath that ironed shirt exterior lay a caged animal, a 440 cubic inch Super Commando V8 that could hurl the car down a quarter mile like a missile and tear through asphalt like a buzzsaw. The 440 Super Commando was no idle threat. This was a pre-Hemi bruiser that punched with 375 horsepower and a mountain-moving 480 pound-feet of torque. What made this engine terrifying wasn't just its output, it was the way it delivered it. Instant, relentless, brutal. The kind of torque that didn't whisper politely. It kicked the back end sideways, bent drive shafts, and made grown men clench the wheel like they were riding out a hurricane. One hard launch and the front end would lift like a speedboat, while the rear tires screamed in protest, struggling to hold on to reality. If you didn't know what you were doing, the car didn't care. It would punish you. And if the road was wet, you weren't going anywhere but sideways, into a ditch, a guardrail, or your nearest regrettable decision. Despite being marketed as the gentleman's muscle car, the GTX had no intentions of keeping things civil. The suspension was standard mid-60s Chrysler fare, vague, wallowy, and tuned more for boulevard cruising than precision handling. The rear end was especially treacherous. Even under ideal conditions, the car was prone to wheel hop under hard launches. In rain or on cold pavement, it might as well have been skating on marbles. One sudden throttle jab and the tail would kick out like it had a death wish. Combine that with steering that felt like it was connected by rubber bands and drum brakes better suited to a garden tractor, and the result was a car that constantly reminded you, you're not in control, you're just negotiating. Braking when needed was more of a suggestion than a command. The factory brakes were little more than heat-soaking, fade-prone iron platters that wilted under pressure. Try to bring this heavyweight down from highway speeds quickly, and the pedal would go soft, the nose would dive, and the car would wander like a drunk in a snowstorm. Downhill or in panic stops, it was genuinely terrifying. More than one owner of the GTX discovered that the true top speed of the car wasn't limited by horsepower. It was limited by nerve. In a straight line, though, the GTX 440 was a revelation. Few cars of its time could match it off the line, and when the rear tires bit, if they bit, it launched like a cannonball. But that same straight-line strength came with consequences. The power came on in a rush, and if you weren't ready, the back end could swing out with zero warning. One moment you were pulling away from a red light with pride. The next, you were counter-steering for dear life, hoping the parked cars would show mercy. And if you thought you could just back off the gas and be safe, surprise, the lift throttle oversteer could be just as brutal. The car would unweight itself mid-corner, and suddenly you were facing the wrong way. In the rain, the GTX became something else entirely. Panic on four wheels. The wide bias-ply tires were practically useless on wet pavement, and the lack of modern traction aids meant every twitch of the gas pedal came with consequences. Hydroplaning was a given. Controlled slides were pipe dreams. One slip, and you were going wherever momentum decided to take you, and it was rarely the direction you had in mind. And yet, despite all its flaws, or perhaps because of them, the 1967 GTX 440 had a raw, addictive appeal. It was the kind of car that didn't try to protect you from your mistakes. It didn't hide its dangers. It was the danger. It forced you to drive with skill, attention, and a little bit of fear. It was loud, it was fast, and it didn't give a damn about being your friend. You respected it, or you ended up in a tree. As one old-school owner once put it looked like a business coupe with a secret, and that secret was violence. A perfect summary of a car that disguised its menace in chrome and vinyl, but underneath packed enough torque to twist a chassis and enough attitude to destroy the unworthy. The GTX wasn't your buddy. It was a loaded gun in a linen suit. And when you got behind the wheel, it wasn't asking, it was warning, respect it, or wrap it around a pole. The 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo 454 SS was one of those cars that never should have been as fast as it was, and was far too fast for its own good. Originally born into the rising trend of personal luxury coupes, the Monte Carlo was meant to be smooth, composed, and stately. It was for the man who wanted comfort first, with a hint of performance edge, not raw violence under the hood. But then Chevy decided to bolt in the monstrous LS4 454 cubic inch big block V8 and slap an SS badge on it. What they created wasn't just a contradiction, it was a contradiction with tire smoke, poor reflexes, and a penchant for self-destruction. Underneath the long sculpted hood of this velvet sledgehammer sat a 454 that pumped out 275 horsepower and 390 lb-ft of torque, numbers that seem modest only because of early smog controls. But even with its power choked by emissions gear, the LS4 was still a brute, launching the car forward with low-end grunt and unshakable force. It didn't so much accelerate as lurch forward, like an overfed lion suddenly snapping into motion. The problem, of course, was that the rest of the car had no interest in keeping up with what the engine was trying to do. At over 4,200 pounds, the 73 Monte Carlo SS was absurdly heavy for anything remotely performance-related. It was a personal luxury car in the truest sense, plush, floaty, and soft around every edge. This was not a vehicle engineered for control at speed. This was a couch on wheels with delusions of NASCAR heritage. The suspension, though redesigned for 73 with a new A-body platform, was still tuned for comfort, not aggression. Try to corner hard in this thing and you were met with wallowing body roll that felt like you'd just taken a turn in a capsizing canoe. The front end would dive under braking, the back end would rise, and your sense of direction became more theoretical than practical. And the brakes, oh the brakes. Equipped with front discs and rear drums, they were laughably inadequate for the sheer mass of the car, especially at high speeds. The big 454 could get the Monte Carlo moving in a hurry, but stopping it felt more like sending up a request to the gods. The brake pedal was soft, fade came quickly under pressure, and emergency stops became exercises in physics, fear, and sheer inertia. You weren't stopping so much as gradually ceasing forward momentum. On a good day, visibility was another strike. That long hood stretched out like the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. And with thick roof pillars and narrow glass, you didn't so much see the road as you guessed where it might be. Add in slow, uncommunicative power steering that offered all the feedback of a sponge, and you had yourself a car that required full-time commitment just to keep pointed forward. And heaven help you if the road curved. Suddenly you weren't in a Monte Carlo anymore. You were in a gliding missile that responded to steering inputs with hesitation, understeer, and mild sarcasm. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the Monte Carlo 454 SS wasn't its weight, or its mushy suspension, or its lazy brakes. It was the illusion of control. To the average driver, the SS badge promised capability, power, sportiness, and yes, it had the engine to deliver straight-line thrills. But that promise ended the moment you had to brake hard, swerve, or react. This was a car that lulled you into confidence, right up until the moment it reminded you it wasn't designed to handle what its engine could dish out. In essence, the 1973 Monte Carlo 454 SS was a masterclass in contradiction. It looked sharp, sounded mean, and made all the right noises. But beneath that rumbling hood was a chassis and suspension system that wanted no part of the action. It was like mounting a jet engine to a tugboat, thrilling in a straight line, terrifying everywhere else. One driver summed it up best. Braking from high speeds was more hope than science. And cornering? You didn't. You aimed and prayed. That's not hyperbole. That's survival strategy. So if you ever slide behind the wheel of a Monte Carlo SS 454, do yourself a favor, admire it, respect it, but never mistake it for a true performance machine. Because while it may have worn the badge of speed, it drove with the soul of a sofa and the stopping power of a gentle whisper. By 1972, the Dodge Coronet Super Bee had already lost much of the youthful exuberance and raw power that had once defined it. The golden era of muscle cars was quickly winding down, and the Super Bee, which had been an icon of speed and swagger since its inception, had morphed into something less refined and, frankly, more troubled. To salvage the fading muscle car icon, Dodge stuffed the big 400 Magnum V8 into the aging B-body frame, hoping the added power would be enough to mask the issues lurking underneath. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The result was a car that both looked and felt like a midlife crisis, with a distinct personality crisis to match. The 400 Magnum engine was a capable beast. With 330 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque, it delivered impressive straight-line performance, throwing the Super Bee down the road with all the aggression you could hope for. But what Dodge failed to account for was the chassis' inability to handle the engine's power in a controlled, stable manner. As a result, the car exhibited the kind of balance that made you wish you were driving something a little more predictable, like a cement truck. The Super Bee had a weight distribution problem, and it was painfully evident when driving. The heavy engine in the front, combined with an older, sagging suspension setup, caused the car to understeer like a bulldozer plowing through mud. Turn the wheel into a corner, and the car resisted. Heavy, sluggish, and unresponsive. But then, in true Super Bee fashion, it would do a complete 180 when you let off the throttle, suddenly oversteering like a shopping cart on a slick floor. It was like the car couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a lumbering brute or a twitchy handful. And in trying to be both, it failed to do either well. The hood bulges, which screamed power and promised big performance, were perhaps the most misleading aspect of the car. They created an illusion of muscle, a muscle that, on the right stretch of road, could unleash an impressive growl. But once you tried to handle that muscle on a tight corner or under braking, the truth was much less flattering. The chassis felt like it was begging for mercy, pleading for Dodge to have stopped with the performance upgrades before they became too much to handle. Braking, too, was an exercise in faith. The big 400 Magnum might have been powerful, but it was a heavy engine, and it didn't exactly pair with the Super Bee's already underwhelming suspension and handling dynamics. Under hard braking, the car tended to nosedive, and keeping it in a straight line was often more of a challenge than you'd expect from a car that was supposed to be built for speed. It wasn't just the stopping power that was lacking. It was the entire experience of trying to manage that power. The Super Bee wasn't as aggressive as it looked. It was clumsy, unpredictable, and downright dangerous when pushed too hard. And all of this came with a hefty price tag for muscle car enthusiasts. The Super Bee, which had once represented youthful rebellion and power, now felt like a reminder of the declining era of muscle cars. It wasn't quite a full-on dinosaur, but it was close, and that reality became clear with every drive. What had once been a symbol of boldness and power had now become a car that made you cringe every time you tried to push it past a basic corner or heavy braking zone. As for the driving experience, it was a mixed bag, and not in the good way. For some, the raw power under the hood was enough to overlook the car's flaws, but for others, the Super Bee was a lesson in how poor engineering could ruin an otherwise promising package. When Dodge placed the 400 Magnum engine in that old frame, it had all the potential to be a classic. But instead, it ended up as a car that felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode in a cloud of smoke and regret. The hood bulges screamed power, but the chassis screamed, "Please stop." That's the truth of the 1972 Dodge Coronet Super Bee 400, a car that looked the part but couldn't back it up when it came to handling, safety, or refinement. A once great muscle car, now a fading relic of the past, struggling to make sense of a world that had already moved on. The 1971 AMC Matador machine concept was an ambitious idea that, thankfully, never fully made it to production. And history would probably say it's a good thing. AMC, which had gained some attention with their relatively successful muscle cars like the AMX, decided to take a bold leap forward with the Matador machine. They intended to create a muscle car that would rival the likes of the Dodge Charger and Ford Torino, something that could turn heads on the street and carve a place for AMC in the performance market. But despite all the bold styling choices and a massive 401 V8 engine under the hood, the Matador machine never stood a chance, and for good reason. The first issue lay in its sheer weight and handling dynamics. The Matador, while looking like it had been designed for high-speed chases, was no more agile than a freight train. AMC had fitted the car with aggressive body styling, wild spoilers, exaggerated front and rear fenders, and a stance that screamed racer. But the chassis and suspension were woefully unprepared to back up that look. The rear was heavy, and the front-end handling left much to be desired. The suspension was too soft for high-speed cornering, and the car's body roll was downright alarming. When the car took a corner at anything above a slow cruise, it felt like it was still in prototype mode, barely holding together as it leaned and wobbled. For a muscle car, that's a fatal flaw. Under the hood, the 401 V8 promised excitement, 330 horsepower, plenty of torque, but in practice, the engine's power delivery was anything but smooth. The car was unpredictable, and the power was often difficult to manage, especially when combined with a steering setup that was sluggish and vague. The 401 V8 could easily launch the Matador machine off the line, but it lacked refinement. There was too much torque for the car's structure, causing the rear end to break loose at the slightest provocation, and the car would fishtail wildly when pushed too hard. The power was there, but there was no control to rein it in, and that combination made the car dangerous to drive fast, especially with the kind of amateur handling you'd expect from a high-performance muscle car. It was a car that demanded respect, but didn't offer enough confidence in return. And then there were the aesthetics, a feature that, in the case of the Matador machine, could have been both its greatest strength and biggest downfall. The styling was radical, especially for AMC, and it gave the car a menacing presence on the road. However, the combination of sharp edges, massive spoilers, and aggressive grille openings left the car looking like it belonged more in a bad sci-fi movie than on the streets of America. It was a face only a mother could love, or perhaps more accurately, one that only the most adventurous buyers could embrace. While it had the potential to be an iconic symbol of 1970s muscle, it just looked out of place, like the automotive equivalent of a person wearing an overly flashy outfit without the confidence to pull it off. The 1971 AMC Matador machine was a car caught between two worlds. It tried to blend muscle car aggression with a more refined design philosophy, but in doing so, it failed to deliver on both fronts. The car wasn't just overstyled, it was overwhelmed by its own ambition. AMC's decision to pull the plug before the car reached production is a rare example of restraint, and it speaks to the limitations of their engineering at the time. They got cold feet, and honestly, it was probably for the best. The Matador machine could have been an impressive sight on the road, but in reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Imagine a muscle car with a massive engine and aggressive styling that couldn't even handle a corner without falling apart. The 401 V8 was a beast, but without the suspension and handling to match, it was like giving a toddler a flamethrower. Dangerous, unpredictable, and definitely not something you'd want to let loose on the open road. It's easy to see why AMC didn't pursue it further. The Matador machine could have been a legend, a symbol of AMC's attempts to break into the big leagues of muscle cars. Instead, it became another what could have been, a wild concept that would never see the light of day. In the end, the car's unfinished potential is what made it so dangerous, not just to drive, but also to the reputation of AMC's already struggling performance lineup. The 1974 Ford Ranchero GT460 was a muscle car hybrid that combined the power of a massive V8 with the weight and handling issues of a pickup truck. Ford's audacity to merge these two worlds resulted in a vehicle that could easily become a death trap for the unsuspecting driver. At first glance, it appeared to be a perfect blend of brute power and rugged utility, but beneath the surface was a ticking time bomb of mismatched components and dangerous engineering. Ford, at the time, was notorious for pushing the limits of automotive performance. The Ranchero, a vehicle that had always been part muscle car, part utility truck, was given the 460 cubic inch V8 engine, a powerhouse designed for muscle cars, not a pickup. This engine delivered an astonishing 365 horsepower, pushing the Ranchero well into muscle car territory, but the vehicle's body and suspension were entirely unprepared to manage this sheer amount of power. The truck's weight, already a burden for any performance car, only exacerbated the problem. The result was a vehicle that was dangerously overpowered for its chassis and suspension, making every turn a gamble and every straight line a test of survival. The leaf spring suspension, originally designed to carry heavy loads, was a poor match for the wild torque produced by the 460 engine. Under hard acceleration, the rear end of the Ranchero GT 460 would jump uncontrollably, causing the vehicle to fishtail and lose traction. The rear axle, struggling to keep up with the overwhelming power, would often hop, as if it were an uncontrollable animal trying to break free. When you pushed the pedal to the floor, the truck felt like it wanted to take off, not just down the road, but straight into the air. The lack of rear-end stability made the Ranchero a nightmare for any driver trying to maintain control. Steering was another area where the Ranchero fell apart. With its weight, the truck was simply too nose-heavy, and the steering system was too slow to provide any real feedback. At high speeds, the combination of poor steering and the massive power under the hood made the Ranchero feel like a wild animal that couldn't be tamed. The steering would feel sluggish and disconnected, offering little in terms of precision, making every lane change or corner a potentially life-threatening decision. In the rain, the Ranchero was even worse, with its rear end sliding out unpredictably in turns, causing the driver to hold on for dear life. Braking was another serious issue with the Ranchero GT 460. The sheer weight of the vehicle combined with the powerful 460-watt V8 created an absurdly long stopping distance. The brakes, designed for a far lighter vehicle, struggled to slow the Ranchero down. When you applied the brakes, there was no sense of confidence, just a feeling of hoping and praying that the truck would stop before you hit something. With its sluggish response and inability to stop quickly, driving this vehicle at high speeds was more of an act of faith than any semblance of safe driving. At a time when muscle cars were still prized for their speed, the Ranchero was a stark reminder that a vehicle's ability to stop was just as important, if not more so, than its ability to accelerate. Handling was where the Ranchero truly showed its weaknesses. On paper, it should have been a great high-performance truck, but the reality was far from it. The truck was a bulldozer on wheels, with its poor suspension system and nose-heavy design making every curve a battle. There was no grace in the way the Ranchero took corners. The truck felt like a runaway freight train, with no finesse to manage the immense power on tap. Any attempt to push it through tight turns ended in disaster, as the back end would want to break loose and slide, making the vehicle nearly impossible to control on anything other than a straight road. It was more of a bull in a china shop than a precision machine. Even the most experienced drivers would have a hard time taming the beast that was the Ranchero GT 460. With all that raw power and an almost complete lack of safety and performance features to match, the truck turned every ride into a high-stakes gamble. If you made the wrong move, or if the road conditions were even slightly unfavorable, the Ranchero would try to kill you. The truck's rear-end instability, combined with the lack of real handling capabilities, made it a recipe for disaster in the wrong hands. A vehicle that was meant to haul heavy loads became a rolling death trap when given the power to accelerate as fast as any muscle car. The 1974 Ford Ranchero GT 460 was a car that could do one thing well: go fast in a straight line. But the moment you asked it to turn, brake, or maintain any semblance of control, it showed its true nature. It was a heavy, chaotic machine with no real consideration for safety or performance. A vehicle that Ford had tried to build on a muscle car platform, but without the necessary upgrades. The 1970 Pontiac Tempest T37 455 HO was a car that had all the promise of a muscle car, but none of the necessary foundations to back it up. Initially conceived as a budget-friendly alternative to the iconic GTO, Pontiac made the critical mistake of dropping the same 455 high-output V8 engine into the T37 that powered the legendary GTO Judge. without giving the car the proper structural upgrades to handle it. While the T-37 was built to be a stripped-down, affordable muscle car, it became a powder keg waiting to explode the moment you hit the gas. Under the hood, the 455 HO V8 was an absolute beast. With its 360 horsepower and 500 lb-ft of torque, the engine was more than capable of launching the T-37 into muscle car territory. The engine could deliver all the raw power you'd expect from a car like the GTO Judge. But Pontiac failed to account for the fact that the T-37's suspension and chassis were nowhere near capable of handling that kind of performance. The suspension was lighter than what you'd find in its more expensive muscle counterparts, which led to unsettling results when the car was pushed hard. The car had an unsettling tendency to twist under heavy acceleration. This wasn't your typical muscle car that felt glued to the road as you blasted down the highway. The T-37 was a floating mess, constantly trying to lose its composure, especially when you were pushing it through tight turns or accelerating quickly from a stop. Under pressure, the car's lightweight suspension couldn't cope with the power of the 455 engine. The body would twist and flex in ways that didn't inspire confidence, giving you the distinct feeling that the car was constantly on the verge of losing control. The T-37 had a powerful engine but a body that felt like it was trying to contain a hurricane. When you mashed the throttle, the T-37 was all about straight-line performance. The 455 engine would surge with immense power, but when it came time to corner or handle a more demanding driving situation, the car would begin to float and drift. There was no stability, no confidence in the suspension or steering. It was as if Pontiac had given the T-37 claws but forgot to give it the spine to keep those claws from snapping back at you. The car's inability to stay planted on the road meant that it was a handful to drive, especially for those who were used to the more refined performance of the GTO or other true muscle cars. This lack of handling and overall stability made the T-37 a ticking time bomb on the road. With all that power but so little control, a small mistake or a quick steering adjustment could easily send the car into a skid, especially on uneven roads or during high-speed maneuvers. While the 455 HO engine was more than capable of thrilling any muscle car enthusiast, the T-37's lightweight design and inadequate suspension turned that thrill into something more akin to terror once you pushed it beyond its limits. In terms of aesthetics and style, the T-37 was bare bones. It had the raw muscle car look, but without the aggressive spoilers and body kits that the higher-end GTOs and Judges flaunted. This lack of visual aggression only accentuated the T-37's internal flaws. It was the cheap alternative to a car that had all the performance, but none of the necessary engineering to contain it. The stripped-down version was supposed to be a bargain, but the lack of adequate suspension, brakes, and handling just made the T-37 feel like a half-baked attempt at greatness. Pontiac's decision to put a powerhouse engine into an otherwise unremarkable chassis proved to be a dangerous one. The T-37 was an exciting proposition on paper, offering all the thrills of a GTO at a more affordable price. However, the reality was that it couldn't keep up with its own power. With its underdeveloped suspension, poor handling, and lack of stability, the T-37 was like trying to ride a wild stallion with no reins. You were bound to get thrown off eventually. The car's performance was all about potential and raw power, but it lacked the refinement and precision that made muscle cars truly great. In short, the 1970 Pontiac Tempest T-37 455 HO was a car that promised much but delivered little in terms of safety and handling. Its lack of a robust suspension, poor chassis design, and inability to stay composed under pressure made it a risky machine to drive, especially for those who were unfamiliar with its unpredictable nature. Pontiac gave it the power of a muscle car, but forgot to equip it with the necessary support systems to keep it on the road. The T-37's claws may have been sharp, but without the spine to back them up, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The 1976 Chevrolet Nova SS 350 was a car that tried to hold on to the fading glory of the muscle car era, but it found itself out of place in a world that had long moved past the days of raw, untamed horsepower. By 1976, the muscle car revolution was dead, and the industry was more focused on safety, fuel efficiency, and practicality than raw power. Yet, the Nova SS350 still clung to the idea of performance, a 350 cubic inch V8 engine packed under the hood. It had the muscle, but what it didn't have was the necessary refinement, handling, or safety to make it anything more than a dangerous relic. The heart of the Nova SS was its 350 V8 engine, a small block powerhouse that could produce a respectable 165 horsepower in a car that was light by the standards of the time. In theory, this was a solid recipe for muscle, offering enough punch for drivers to feel the thrill of acceleration. But while the 350 could pull hard in a straight line, it was anything but stable. The build quality by 1976 had seriously deteriorated, and the Nova SS's performance was compromised by a variety of shortcomings that made it as dangerous as it was fast. Steering was one of the first issues. Loose and imprecise, it gave the driver no real connection to the road. It was as if the car was moving on its own, not under the command of the driver. Precision was a rare commodity in the Nova SS 350, making quick maneuvers or evasive actions downright perilous. The steering response was so vague that it felt like the car could veer off course at any moment, a critical problem when driving at higher speeds or in emergency situations. Braking was another major problem. The brakes, already underwhelming by the standards of the mid-70s, suffered from a tendency to fade under pressure. In a high-speed scenario or during hard braking, the Nova SS 350's brakes simply couldn't keep up. What should have been a car that could handle quick stops became a vehicle that could only hope to slow down in a reasonable distance. In an emergency, there was no trust to be had in the braking system, and every stop felt like a gamble. Inside, the Nova SS 350 was a disappointment, even by 1976 standards. The interior was nothing more than cheap, hollow materials that screamed of cost-cutting. The seats felt like they were made from cardboard, with little to no padding, offering no comfort for the driver or passengers. The interior was a reminder that this car was designed with performance in mind, not luxury or safety. But even worse was the feeling of regret, the feeling that you had bought into a muscle car with little of the substance that made the classics so legendary. The Nova SS 350 could be quick in a straight line, but that speed was nothing more than a veil hiding its deeper flaws. It was fast in theory, the engine had the muscle to launch the car, and the SS badge promised performance. But in practice, it was a car that couldn't handle its own power. The loose steering made it unstable, and the brakes made it a ticking time bomb on the road. The interior was a poor excuse for comfort or safety, and the car's build quality left much to be desired. Driving the 1976 Chevrolet Nova SS 350 was a reminder that sometimes power without control is just a dangerous recipe. In a world where performance had become secondary to safety and refinement, the Nova SS 350 was a reminder of the muscle car era's darker side. A car that tried to cling to the past, but ultimately wasn't built to survive the changing times. It was a car that could have been a sleeper, a vehicle that could have turned heads if it was given the attention it deserved. But in the end, it was just a reminder of what happens when you take the spirit of the muscle car without understanding what it truly takes to make a car safe and enjoyable to drive. Fast in a straight line, but lethal in every other regard, the 1976 Nova SS 350 was a symbol of an era that had passed, a car that couldn't quite make the transition to the new age of driving. It was fast, yes, but it was also a time bomb, waiting for the moment when it would fail under pressure. For all its muscle, the Nova SS 350 was a relic, fighting a battle it couldn't win. The 1972 Mercury Montego GT 429 was an ambitious attempt by Mercury to blend the refined world of luxury with the raw power of muscle cars. However, in trying to be both, it ended up failing at being either. Marketed as a gentleman's muscle car, the Montego GT was supposed to offer the elegance of a luxury coupe, but when optioned with the massive 429 cubic inch V8, it became a beast that had no business masquerading as a smooth and sophisticated ride. The car's attempts at blending class with power ended up as a confusing mess, one that was too heavy for the speed it promised, too stiff for comfort, and dangerously unpredictable when pushed too far. The Montego GT's 429 engine packed a lot of muscle, around 370 horsepower, which on paper would give it plenty of punch. However, this power was at odds with the car's overall design. The Montego was a heavy vehicle, and the addition of the 429 engine only made it more cumbersome. In a straight line, the Montego GT 429 could accelerate with impressive force, but this power was wasted on a chassis that wasn't built to handle it properly. The car was sluggish when it came to responding to corners, and while it could churn through the miles with ease, it lacked the agility that the muscle car segment was known for. It had the power but couldn't effectively put it to use in a performance context. The suspension, designed for comfort, was too stiff to properly absorb the power and weight of the 429 engine, making for a rough ride. On bumpy roads or tight corners, the car felt like it was fighting the road, and any notion of refinement evaporated as the car bounced and jostled its occupants. It wasn't the smooth luxury ride that Mercury had hoped for, and it certainly wasn't the aggressive, performance-focused ride that muscle car enthusiasts craved. When it came to stopping the Montego GT 429, the car's braking system was another serious issue. The weight of the car combined with the power of the 429 engine and its inadequate brakes made for a frightening combination. When pushed, the car had a tendency to keep going long after the driver had hit the pedal. The braking performance was lackluster, especially when compared to other vehicles in its class, and at higher speeds, it was nothing short of terrifying. The idea of driving this muscle luxury hybrid with any sense of security was an illusion. It was only a matter of time before that lack of braking power became the car's Achilles heel. Handling was another crucial flaw that the Montego GT couldn't overcome. Despite its muscle car ambitions, the Montego was too slow to change direction quickly, too heavy to maintain control in high-speed turns, and too rigid in its suspension to feel connected to the road. The Montego GT didn't have the precision or the finesse that you'd expect from a true performance car. Instead, it had a tendency to fight back, unpredictably swerving and sliding when things went wrong. Whether it was the stiff suspension making the car bounce around on uneven roads, or the lack of sufficient grip in corners, the Montego GT was a car that could easily spin out of control. Its exterior, with its luxury coupe styling, made it look like a refined vehicle. But the moment you got behind the wheel, all of that elegance vanished. The Montego GT 429 was a brutal car to drive. It lacked the road manners of both the luxury car it tried to imitate and the muscle car it tried to embody. It was a confused beast that didn't know what it wanted to be, and as a result, failed at both. The Montego GT's identity crisis didn't just stop with its performance issues. Its design, too, failed to live up to the promise of sophistication and speed. The car looked great on paper, especially with its long hood and aggressive styling cues, but the reality of driving it was a far cry from the luxurious, fast, or thrilling experience you would expect from such a vehicle. When things went wrong, and in the Montego GT 429 they often did, the car would quickly turn from a luxury car into a hazard. With poor handling, sluggish braking, and a stiff, unrefined ride, the Montego GT 429 was prone to spinning out of control, turning what should have been a pleasant drive into a dangerous experience. It had the power, but no control. It had the looks, but no finesse. The Montego GT 429 wasn't a luxury muscle car. It was an overpowered, ill-balanced mess that left both Mercury and its drivers disappointed. In essence, the 1972 Mercury Montego GT 429 was a lesson in why attempting to be everything to everyone often results in failure. It tried to merge luxury with performance, but it couldn't deliver on either front. It looked like a sophisticated gentleman's car, but under the hood, it was a brutish muscle machine with no grace. When pushed to its limits, it wasn't a gentleman's ride. It was a brute that could easily spin out of control and leave its driver in a world of trouble. The 1975 Oldsmobile Cutlass Salon 455 was the epitome of misguided ambition. What started as a luxury-themed fastback quickly spiraled into a tail-heavy nightmare when Oldsmobile decided to stuff a 455 cubic inch V8 engine under the hood, a power plant typically reserved for far more aggressive vehicles. The result was a car that looked like it was designed for comfortable cruising, but drove like it had a death wish. At first glance, the Cutlass Salon 455 appeared to be the perfect blend of style and performance. Its fastback design was sleek, and it had a luxury interior that promised comfort and refinement. But that 455 V8, with its massive torque and hefty engine weight, threw everything out of balance. The car's rear end was now burdened with the sheer weight of the engine, making the Cutlass feel less like a smooth cruiser and more like a runaway freight train. From the moment you touched the gas pedal, the Cutlass Salon 455 felt like it was fishtailing. The rear end, overloaded by the 455, struggled to maintain traction, especially when you tried to accelerate hard. Even before the car hit full speed, you could feel the tail end squirming beneath you, making every drive a white-knuckled experience. This wasn't the sort of smooth, powerful acceleration you'd expect from a car with a luxury pedigree. It was an unpredictable, slippery mess that left you guessing what would happen next. The rear of the car seemed ready to break loose at any moment, threatening to spin out even with the gentlest tap on the gas pedal. Oldsmobile, aware of the imbalance, tried to remedy the situation by adding a sport suspension to the Salon. However, this was like trying to put track shoes on a walrus. The suspension, designed to tame the ferocious engine, only made matters worse. While the idea was to provide better handling and stability, it simply couldn't compensate for the fundamental problem. The car was just too heavy in the back. The suspension couldn't counteract the massive torque of the 455 engine, and the car continued to exhibit unstable handling, particularly in corners and under acceleration. It became clear that no suspension tweak or enhancement could fix the root issue. This car was never meant to carry such a large, powerful engine. In a straight line, the Cutlass Salon 455 could certainly perform. The 455 V8 engine was undeniably potent, and it could launch the car down the road with impressive force. But it was never a pleasurable experience. The car's handling was unpredictable, and every hard turn or sudden acceleration could easily send the tail end sliding. It was a car that demanded constant attention, as you never really knew if the next burst of speed would send you into a fishtail or a full-on spin. In high-speed situations, the Cutlass Salon 455 was a nightmare waiting to happen. The combination of tail-heavy weight distribution and a stiff suspension meant that the car had no real composure when the road got twisty. Every corner felt like a gamble, and any attempt at aggressive driving quickly turned into an act of survival. What was meant to be a luxury car with a bit of muscle had turned into a rolling contradiction. It was neither a comfortable cruiser nor a true muscle car. It was an unstable beast, struggling to balance the two. Even with all its flaws, the Cutlass Salon 455 still looked the part. Its sleek fastback lines were undeniably stylish, and the interior, packed with luxury features, felt like it belonged in a much more refined vehicle. But the moment you got behind the wheel, it was clear that the Cutlass Salon was a car of compromise. A car that tried to be something it wasn't. The 455 engine wasn't made for this kind of vehicle, and the resulting combination was a dangerous one. In the end, the 1975 Oldsmobile Cutlass Salon 455 was a testament to the idea that power alone doesn't make a great car. When you mismatch the wrong engine with the wrong chassis, the result is a chaotic, uncontrollable mess. It looked good, it had plenty of power, but it was ultimately a car that was unpredictable, unwieldy, and downright dangerous to drive at the limit. It was a rolling contradiction, a car that promised both luxury and muscle, but delivered neither with any consistency. Instead, it was a fast, heavy, fishtailing disaster that left drivers praying for stability as they tried to navigate its wild, unpredictable power. The 1977 Chrysler Cordoba 400 Magnum became a symbol of excess, a massive, luxury-laden car that looked the part of a refined cruiser but drove like a bloated barge with an identity crisis. Known for its famous fine Corinthian leather, an emblem of luxury, the Cordoba was never meant to be a performance machine. Chrysler's focus was on comfort and prestige, not on creating a car that could handle well or stop quickly. But when they decided to slot the 400 Magnum engine under the hood, the Cordoba transformed into a hulking behemoth that barely fit its own ambition. Under the hood, the 400 Magnum V8 was a hefty power plant, potent enough for some heavy lifting, but hopelessly mismatched for a car this large and ungainly. At low speeds, it struggled to get up to any respectable pace, as the heavy body made acceleration feel like it was trying to pull a cruise ship out of port. For a car that was marketed as an elegant luxury coupe, The Cordoba's sluggish performance was almost insulting. You'd mash the gas pedal and wait, and wait, and wait some more. It was as if the car wasn't just struggling with its size, but was actively resisting any attempt to move with urgency. But once it finally found its stride, after what seemed like an eternity, the sheer weight of the beast made it just as slow to slow down. The brakes were overwhelmed by the car's bulk, and stopping the Cordoba felt like trying to halt a runaway freight train. Whether you were heading into a sharp turn or just trying to navigate a simple stoplight, the brakes could barely keep up with the mass they were supposed to control. The result was a car that demanded far more distance to stop than its sluggish acceleration would imply. What should have been a smooth cruise became a battle for control as the car stubbornly lumbered towards whatever obstacle lay ahead. As for handling, the Cordoba wasn't any better. The steering felt loose, disconnected, and vague, like trying to guide a ship through a narrow alley. There was no real feedback from the road, making it nearly impossible to gauge how much grip was actually available. As you turned the wheel, you were left with a disconcerting lack of certainty. The car seemed to take forever to respond to even the most minor adjustments, making you feel as though you were attempting to steer a floating mass rather than a vehicle designed for the road. Any attempt at pushing the car through curves felt like a risk. The vague handling meant that you weren't sure if you were in control or if the car would just suddenly veer off course. Visibility was another major issue. The thick pillars, giant dashboard, and oversized hood made it difficult to see out of the car, especially when trying to change lanes or navigate tight spaces. It wasn't just a challenge to park, it was a challenge to drive the Cordoba in any setting where spatial awareness was key. The thick, unwieldy A-pillars obstructed your forward view, and the rear window felt like it belonged in a boat rather than a car. Changing lanes on the highway required a level of trust in the other drivers around you, because you simply couldn't see much of anything in your blind spots. But perhaps the most accurate way to describe the 1977 Chrysler Cordoba 400 Magnum was as a land-based billboard. It was enormous, flashy, and somehow missed the point of the very brand it was trying to promote. The exterior's bulk and garishness screamed luxury, while the interior's Corinthian leather hinted at grandeur. But when it came to the driving experience, the Cordoba felt like a floating, unresponsive mess. It hated corners, didn't want to accelerate, and practically begged for more braking distance than it could afford. Despite the car's reputation as a luxury cruiser, it never lived up to the image it was trying to project. The 400 Magnum engine gave it more muscle than it ever needed, but that didn't translate into a better driving experience. Instead, it made the car more of a danger on the road, turning every drive into a test of patience and survival. The Chrysler Cordoba was not so much a car as it was a reminder of how misplaced ambition and a lack of practical design could result in a dangerously unwieldy machine. It was a car that looked like it belonged on a yacht, but felt like it was sinking as soon as you tried to drive it. The 1971 Chevrolet Biscayne 427 police package was a beast crafted for one singular purpose: to chase down criminals at high speeds. Designed as a stripped-down, no-frills police pursuit vehicle, this full-size sedan was built for raw power and sheer durability, and it showed in every aspect of the car. The idea was simple: give law enforcement officers a car that could outrun, outlast, and overpower anything on the road. And that's exactly what Chevrolet delivered, but with a few complications when that power made its way into civilian hands. At its core was the formidable 427 cubic inch V8, a monster engine that could produce a staggering amount of horsepower and torque. The engine was purpose-built for high-speed chases, not for leisurely drives to the grocery store. It was designed to push the Biscayne to extreme speeds, and when it did so with an intense and unforgiving force. The acceleration was brutal, the noise was deafening, and the heat radiating from the engine bay was enough to cook an egg on the dashboard. It was an engine that was born for speed, but not for comfort. And comfort? That was a luxury the Biscayne didn't have time for. The car was stripped down to the bare essentials, leaving out any semblance of creature comforts or convenience. There were no power windows, no air conditioning, and no insulation between you and the loud, constant roar of the engine. The seats were hard, the ride was rough, and every bump in the road was felt with a vengeance. This was a car designed to be tough, reliable, and functional. But comfort wasn't part of the equation. The absence of insulation meant that the interior quickly became a furnace, with the heat from the engine pouring into the cabin, adding to the oppressive, uncomfortable nature of the experience. No fancy noise-canceling technology here. Just the cacophony of the engine, the tires, and the constant hum of road vibrations. It was an assault on the senses, and if you weren't used to the experience, it could be downright unbearable. The lack of power options and other modern conveniences made it feel like you were piloting a tank on bald tires. The steering was heavy and unresponsive, requiring significant effort to maneuver the car, especially at high speeds. The tires, designed for durability rather than grip, were often a step behind the engine's power, making cornering or braking a nerve-wracking experience. At high speeds, the car felt like it was going to slip out from under you at any moment, with the rear end threatening to break loose if you weren't careful. It was a raw, unpolished machine that was just as dangerous as it was fast. Driving one off-duty wasn't just an odd experience, it was a reckless one. You were behind the wheel of a car designed for high-speed chases with little regard for handling, stability, or practicality. It was fast and terrifying in equal measure, with a steering response that didn't quite match the raw speed underfoot. The car's brakes were heavy and unrefined, struggling to bring the 427's power to a halt, especially once it had gained momentum. Even getting the car to a stop in a straight line required both skill and caution, as the Biscayne felt more like a freight train than a precision instrument. And yet, despite its glaring lack of refinement, the 1971 Chevrolet Biscayne 427 police package was an unforgettable ride. Its sheer force, speed, and menacing presence made it a formidable machine on the road. For those fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, enough to drive one off-duty, it was an experience that could only be described as chaotic. There was little finesse, no comfort, and no easy way to tame the beast. In the end, the Biscayne 427 police package was a reminder of a time when raw power and brute force ruled the streets, and subtlety was for the weak. It was an exhilarating ride, but also a terrifying one. A machine that demanded respect, if not outright fear. For those lucky enough to find themselves behind the wheel of one, it was a constant test of nerve and skill. And for those on the road around it, it was a reminder that the line between law enforcement and chaos was often razor thin. The 1978 Pontiac Le Mans Can-Am 455 swap was one of those cars that seemed to exist on the fringes of automotive history, a forgotten oddity with a story that almost no one remembers. Yet it carries with it a legacy that's as strange as it is intriguing. Only a handful of these cars were ever made, and fewer still managed to survive the years. Its identity, a mashup of performance aspirations and misguided engineering, left it somewhere between a wild experiment and a poorly executed fantasy. Pontiac's Can-Am nameplate, inspired by the wild, unrestricted racing series of the same name, had a certain cachet. The idea of slapping a legendary Can-Am badge on a civilian vehicle promised performance and audacity, yet the execution often left much to be desired. The Le Mans, a fairly pedestrian model, was far from a high-performance machine by 1978. But Pontiac, seemingly determined to revive the spirit of the 1960s and early 70s muscle car heyday, decided to infuse some of that racing DNA into the Le Mans. Enter the Can-Am, complete with aggressive bodywork, unique decals, and, for a few lucky, or perhaps unlucky, buyers, the engine swap of their dreams. The 455 cubic inch V8. The 455, one of Pontiac's most iconic big blocks, was a formidable engine in its prime. When swapped into the Le Mans, it unleashed a torrent of horsepower and torque, promising raw power for those daring enough to handle it. However, this transplant, though seemingly a stroke of genius, was a bit like sticking a lion's head on a lamb's body. The car was woefully unprepared for the kind of power the 455 unleashed. First off, the suspension was underwhelming at best. The Le Mans wasn't designed to handle the weight and torque of such a monster engine, and the results were immediately apparent. The suspension couldn't keep the car stable, and in high-speed maneuvers, the car would feel skittish and unrefined. On anything but the smoothest roads, the Le Mans was a handful, and not in the fun way. It was shaky, prone to unpredictable handling, and felt like it was constantly on the verge of losing control. Then there was the issue of airflow and heat. The 455 engine, while a performance powerhouse, had a tendency to run hot, and the Le Mans design wasn't exactly conducive to keeping temperatures under control. The engine bay had poor airflow, which led to serious heat soak issues. On long drives or even during spirited runs, the car was prone to overheating, and its cooling system was ill-equipped to manage the heat generated by the engine. The result was frequent breakdowns, making the Le Mans more of a rolling problem than a performance car. The very thing that should have made it an adrenaline-fueled experience, the raw power of the 455, was undermined by the car's inability to handle it effectively. The bodywork, with its wild Can-Am-inspired design, looked the part, but it didn't do much to improve the car's performance. The aggressive spoilers and sculpted lines may have screamed performance, but in reality they were more for show than for function. The car's aerodynamics were lacking, making it prone to instability at high speeds and further exacerbating its handling problems. The styling may have caught eyes, but the underlying mechanics simply couldn't live up to the aesthetic promises. Despite these issues, the Le Mans Can-Am with the 455 swap has garnered a sort of cult status among automotive enthusiasts, but not necessarily for the right reasons. It's a car that represents a fleeting moment of misguided ambition, one that attempted to revive a long-lost era of muscle car glory, but did so with little regard for the practicalities of modern engineering. The result was a strange hybrid, a performance car that wasn't quite ready to be a performance car, with just enough potential to make you dream, but not enough to deliver. Its rarity and quirks have made it a forgotten legend in the annals of American muscle, but perhaps that's for the best. The 1978 Pontiac Le Mans Can-Am 455 swap serves as a reminder that not every muscle car dream was meant to be realized. It had the appearance of greatness, the name of greatness, but lacked the substance beneath the hood to back it up. And so it remains, a car largely relegated to obscurity, a what could have been story that never truly came to pass.